President Johnson was also a supporter of national parks and of the national park system, and it was improved for future generations during and through the establishment of urban parks, national recreation areas, and the National Park Foundation in 1967. President Johnson is credited, as most of you know, with one of the most robust legislative records in the history of the United States, from the War on Poverty to the Civil Rights Act, as well as education reforms and Medicare. The lasting impact of his vision and the relevancy to our great nation is being felt even today. In April of this year, we had the great opportunity to partner with NASA and others to highlight the Great American Total Eclipse, which gave us a unique opportunity to highlight President Johnson's record of championing space exploration. To me personally, as the acting superintendent, President Johnson's unique Texas Hill Country approach to diplomacy, both domestic and international, is what I have gained the most appreciation for during my tenure. The opportunity to tour the Texas White House with Lyndon Nugent, grandson of President LBJ, and hear firsthand some of the personal stories of how both the presidency and the Johnson family and this entire community coexisted during that significant period is just something that I can't even put a price to. It's a legacy we're compelled to celebrate, compelled to preserve, and to educate future generations about. President Johnson's vision for a great society remains relevant today. And in this election year, the remarks shared by President Johnson on August 6, 1965, in the Capitol Rotunda at the signing of the Voting Rights Act ring powerful, regardless of which side of the political aisle you choose. And I quote, "And I pledge you that we will not delay, or we will not hesitate, or we will not turn aside until all Americans of every race and color and origin in this country have the same right as all others to share in this process of democracy." With that, I'm going to invite our honored guests for entry for the official party and presentation of the wreath. Colonel Freds, Shelton Coleman, Jorge, please join me as we salute the wreath, and the Air Force Bugler will be right outside. We'll be playing taps. Thank you so much. Please be seated, guests. We are so very fortunate to have all of you with us today and to have several speakers who will be reflecting with us on President Johnson's accomplishments and enduring legacy. It is now my great honor to introduce Colonel Will Freds, the Deputy Commander of Joint Base San Antonio in the 502nd Air Base Wing. The 8,000-person 502nd Air Base Wing consolidates 49 installation management support functions for a military community with an annual operating budget of more than $700 million. The Joint Base supports more than 80,000 full-time personnel, 145,000 students, and a retiree community of more than 250,000 right here in nearby Military City, USA. The 502nd Air Base Wing supports more than $37 billion in annual projects, and the organization has host responsibilities for Joint Base San Antonio, Fort Sam Houston, Camp Bullis, Lackland, Randolph, and 7 other operating locations. Colonel Freds has been in San Antonio for a couple of years now, and he graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point with a degree in political science. Upon graduation, he was commissioned as a field artillery officer, and since then he has held a variety of leadership positions for the U.S. Army. Colonel Freds completed multiple professional military training and advanced educational programs, and prior to his current position, the colonel was the Chief of Staff for U.S. Army North Task Force 51. The colonel is a native of Northwest Indiana, yay to the Great Lakes. He has a Master of Science degree in Business Administration from San Diego State University, Master of Defense Studies degree from the Canadian Forces College, and a Master of Strategic Studies degree with the U.S. Army War College. He's deployed twice to the Republic of Korea and completed 1 tour in Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Thank you very much, Colonel Freds, for joining us here today.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Christine. And thank you to friends of the President Johnson family and to the National Park Service, to all those from the community that are here today to celebrate such a bright light in our country. It's these giants that we stand on their shoulders, and I'm very happy to be able to talk with you today a little bit about how we're carrying on that legacy at Joint Base San Antonio. Thanks for the opportunity to be here for today's celebration as we recognize the 116th birthday of President Lyndon Baines Johnson and reflect on the enduring legacy that he left behind. On behalf of Brigadier General Randy Oakland, the commander of Joint Base San Antonio and the 502nd Air Base Wing, it's an honor to be here today representing the members of our armed forces as we celebrate one of our nation's foremost leaders and native sons of Texas, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, you might be asking yourselves, what's an Army guy representing the Air Force? It's joint basing is a very interesting beast, and Brigadier General Oakland is an Air Force general. I'm an Army colonel, and one of 2 Army colonels in that 8,000-person organization that she just described. The Air Base Wing is quite large. But I'm learning Air Force, and part of working together is leading together. And so General Oakland and I have really enjoyed getting to know each other. He just recently took command, and just really glad to be here to share with you today. So President Johnson once said that there are no problems that we cannot solve together, and very few that we can solve by ourselves. This indomitable spirit of community and humble acknowledgement that we are more than I gets right at the heart of American achievement. I've served at Joint Base San Antonio for over 2 years, and I can say for certain that America's soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, guardians, and Coast Guardsmen, we have a very diverse force, live this quote daily and have made teamwork a way of life, what we do each and every day. Without a doubt, President Johnson served as Commander-in-Chief during a challenging time in American history. Despite facing a tumultuous era of domestic and international turmoil, President Johnson remained steadfast in his commitment to unite our country and resolve the complex challenges that confronted us. It is worth noting that many of these challenges still persist today as simple fact of life. Global conflict has always existed and always will. America is still engaged in that great power competition that we've talked about, and there are peer nations that continue to seek power and influence, often disregarding the values and morals that we hold dear as a nation. Today, as in the past, these countries aim to challenge our position on the world stage, mistakenly assuming a lack of courage and unity on our part. What they fail to understand is that our nation has evolved largely due to the vision, values, and ideals that President Johnson championed. Our military, in particular, stands as a testament to his foresight, resilience, and determination. Today, we have a professional and diverse all-volunteer force focused on working as a team regardless of which uniform we wear or who we are. Solving problems together is what we do, and it enables us to answer our nation's call anytime, anywhere. As we enter the next great power competition, we are stronger and more united than ever before, in large part due to the foundation and vision built by President Johnson. Our military is a shining example of the progress that we have made as a nation, and we continue to strive to meet today's challenges with the same courage and unity that he demonstrated, making us the greatest armed forces in the world. This is not the only way in the military that we have helped to keep President Johnson's ideals and beliefs alive. As you all know, President Johnson cared deeply about the people of our great nation, and he revered the great society and commitment to enhancing the American quality of life. And it probably had the most profound impact on our society. The programs, policies, and legislation that he championed have not only left a lasting legacy, but have also inspired the many values that we hold dear in our military. President Johnson's steadfast efforts to uplift his fellow Americans are reflected in the initiatives that we undertake at Joint Base San Antonio to improve the quality of life for our service members and their families. We have brought together military leaders, community partners, and military families to tackle 5 very significant issues: childcare, education, healthcare, housing, and spouse employment. Our collaborations with local organizations and community outreach have yielded some amazing success. Projects like the Brighton Center, which provides support to children of military families with special needs. Programs like Pre-K for SA, which currently is providing a pre-K education to over 300 military children, and San Antonio Ready to Work, ensuring that education and training are accessible to our service members and their families, providing better employment opportunities for our military families and the community. Similar to President Johnson's vision for the Job Corps, we carry forward with initiatives like the JBSA Transition Alliance, which strives to offer a smooth transition for service members and their families as they leave the military. Through educational support, training, and networking, we aim to create fulfilling careers for those transitioning out of the military, an undertaking that continues President Johnson's vision and promotes the prosperity that he envisioned for all Americans, reaffirming President Johnson's belief that truly there are no problems that we cannot solve together. In closing, I ask that we all remember President Johnson's words, for they are just as relevant now as they were then. There are no problems that we cannot solve together. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I wish you all a great day.
You're amazing. Thank you very much, Colonel Fretz. And it is my very great pleasure to introduce Shelton Coleman. Shelton is the grandson of Melvin and Anita Winters, who were longtime close friends of President and Mrs. Johnson. He grew up with the history of the Johnsons, like many of you in the room today. Shelton was also a very active board member of the Friends of LBJ, the Friends Group for Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park. Shelton is a businessman who lives in Johnson City and is very active in the community, including serving on City Council. Thank you, Mr. Coleman, for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone show up today. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to get out of that section that shows on my face. So, is it not showing? I don't want to look. Okay, good. Thank you. I'd like to thank Christine Jacobs and our acting superintendent for the kind introduction, and Colonel Freds of Joint Base San Antonio for honoring. It's an honor being on the event with you. I'd also like to thank the National Park Service and the Friends Group for hosting this annual event. When asked to speak today, I initially wondered what I could say. I met President and Mrs. Johnson a number of times as a child, and I hesitate to share my experiences. However, I realized I could recount a few stories of my own and from what I've heard through the years from my parents, W.C. and Joyce Coleman, and my grandparents, Melvin and Anita Winters. My grandmother grew up playing with the Johnson children as they lived in town, and her father had a blacksmith shop, what is now known as Nugent Avenue in Johnson City. She would spend time with them at the boyhood home and recalled President Johnson's storytelling sessions on the front porch of the house. She particularly remembered an incident when he climbed into the hay loft of the Red Barn and fell and broke his arm during one of his lengthy speeches. My grandfather first met President Johnson when he was building the road from Johnson City to Round Mountain. The road crew camped at the river, and many people in town were unhappy because most of the workers back then were young black men. Grandpa was at the barber shop in town one day, and a group of guys started giving him a hard time, telling him to get out of town. A young LBJ was watching all of this as a scuffle occurred. My grandfather was banging this gentleman's head on the ground, shouting, "Do my workers stay? Do my workers stay?" Needless to say, the workers stayed, and the road was finished. After that, President Johnson went to California with several of the Johnson City Crider boys. That didn't last too long. So when he came back, he started work with my grandfather on the road crew doing roads. My grandparents built a new house in Johnson City, on the one I live in today, in 1951, the same year that LBJ purchased the now Texas White House and LBJ Ranch. Mrs. Johnson was tasked with the remodel and was making multiple trips back and forth from Austin to the LBJ Ranch. After a while, she decided she would just stay with my grandparents and drive because the drive was just too long back into Austin. On one occasion, my grandparents were on the way home, but Mrs. Johnson made it to the house before them. She had a key so she could get in, but it didn't work. She wasn't good with locks, she once said. When my grandparents pulled in the driveway just then and seeing half of Mrs. Johnson inside the house and half of Mrs. Johnson outside the house, she was stuck in the window. After they helped her down, they all got a good laugh, and that story has been told many, many, many times. She also was stuck on the low water crossing at the old entrance to the ranch one rainy day. Then Senator Johnson called my grandfather and Judge Morrison to help get her and the car off the crossing before the river flooded. During the Senate years, they would get together anytime they were at the ranch. They had many dinners for birthdays, holidays, and of course playing dominoes at either the ranch, my grandparents' house, the Morrison's house, or the Crims. During his vice presidency, the Johnsons acquired the Haywood Ranch, which was along Lake Granite Shoals at the time. The vice president, Mrs. Johnson, Lucy and Linda, plus a boatload of others would float over to my grandparents' lake house for one of my grandfather's famous fried fish dinners. During his presidency, President Johnson loved to play hide and seek with the Secret Service. He had the fastest boat on the lake, so he would find a cove in Coca-Cola Ranch, which is now Horseshoe Bay, and hide from them. But a few months later, the Secret Service showed up with a twin-engine boat that he could no longer outrun. And y'all, you can imagine that he was not happy about that. On November 20th, 1963, 2 days before my grandmother's birthday, the Johnsons flew into my grandparents' airstrip behind the house, and they presented them both with shotguns from Belgium for her birthday. After the Johnsons boarded the plane, and they said, "We would see you on the 22nd for the barbecue honoring President and Mrs. Kennedy at the ranch." Well, of course, we all know that never happened. Things changed after that. Several months after, a naval officer communications officer showed up at the house advising my grandparents that they were going to install a phone that would connect directly to the switchboard at the LBJ Ranch. They could then direct the call to the White House in Washington, D.C. if necessary. He installed one in their bedroom and another at the airplane hangar. And of course, the grandkids were told to never, ever, ever pick up that phone. Well, you know what happens when you tell kids what not to do. We picked up the phone several times, but a kind officer on the other end would say, "Hang up the phone, boys." As a child, it wasn't always fun having the President of the United States be your friends with your family. My brother and cousins and I remember being at our lake house in the swimming pool and hearing helicopters in the distance. We all knew our fun times were over, and we knew our fun was over. Secret Service agents would sweep in, taking anything that resembled a weapon or a gun, even if it was plastic. Then we all had to be on our best behavior, but we were always sent to the bedrooms as kids were better out of sight. Once at Christmas, we were all at my grandparents' ranch outside Johnson City, and the loud roar of the helicopters landed outside. We hoped it was Santa Claus helicoptering in, bringing gifts. Well, it wasn't. It was President and Mrs. Johnson and the entourage. So we said our hellos and then shuffled off to the bedrooms as usual. They did, however, bring us gifts, so that was good. And then once in Johnson City, at the Johnson City house, the grown-ups were in the house and the kids, including Lucy, were outside playing around the swimming pool. For some reason, Lucy pushed my older cousin Stephen in the pool, clothes and all. And for some reason, of course, Stephen got in trouble, but Lucy, however, didn't. President Johnson had a special room off the main house at the lake house that we had for his use. He had a telephone and for meetings and other things. And again, we were told never to go into that room without a parent. Well, again, you know what we would do. We'd sneak in, sit in his chair, or jump on the bed. We always got caught, and we always got in trouble. During the years after the assassination, they didn't see the Johnsons as much, but they communicated the old-fashioned way by U.S. mail. Of course, if they were at the ranch, a domino game had to be played, dinners had to be eaten, and rides around the ranch had to be taken. I have many letters from the President and Mrs. Johnson thanking my parents and grandparents for little gifts they would send for birthdays and anniversaries. It's kind of funny to read them now, as it seems stockings for Mrs. Johnson were a big hit and handkerchiefs for the President. Many of you have souvenirs from the President and Mrs. Johnson. I think they gave my grandparents and parents everything ever produced. Presidential shavers, water picks, medallions, lighters, ashtrays, pins, Air Force One's decks of cards, candy dishes, cufflinks, lipstick cases, and clocks. I also have a U.S. Senate restaurant menu signed by Senator Johnson to my mother. And then I also have my grandmother's Ladies for Linen outfit she wore for the campaign. And they gave my grandmother the coveted wishing well charm. And my grandfather, they gave him a President's Rolex watch engraved to MCW from LBJ's Xmas to 65. Most everything is displayed at my house, which I inherited from my grandparents. We still call the bedroom where Mrs. Johnson stayed the Ladybird bedroom. The walls in my den are covered with pictures of the Johnsons, some with my grandparents and others with not. I sometimes feel like I live in a mini LBJ museum, as my office is now the den, and all the Johnsons and others are always watching me. A few of my favorite pictures of them are on Air Force One and at the White House in the Rose Garden. Another is President Johnson holding my grandfather's hand with Lucy and Judge Morrison alongside at one of the famous barbecues. I have binders and binders of letters, invitations, newspaper articles, magazines of the Johnsons. I think they kept every letter, every envelope, and every presidential wrapping paper that was ever given to them. When President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson returned to the ranch after his presidency, they all still got together for meals and rides around the ranches, of course, and dominoes, but things did slow down for them all. After his death, they would see Mrs. Johnson some, but she was busy with family and working on the Wildflower Center. She kept writing those famous Ladybird letters, or I'm guessing maybe Shirley James wrote those too. She would ask for advice from my grandfather about ranching issues or just to see how everyone was doing. He died in October of 1990, but my grandmother and Mrs. Johnson kept in contact. We would see her at birthdays or weddings through the years, but my grandmother passed away in June of 2006 and Mrs. Johnson in July of 2007. After Mrs. Johnson's funeral in Austin, the procession made its way by my grandmother's house on its way to the family cemetery. Like most of Johnson City, my mother was watching from the house entrance along the highway. An American statesman reporter asked my mother what she remembered about Mrs. Johnson. My mother replied, how gracious and thoughtful she was, and she always smelled so good. When the article was published, all that made it in was my mother said she always smelled so good. I think my mother was a little bit embarrassed that that's all that was published. When I moved back to Johnson City in 2012, I was invited to be on the Friends Board. We had so many significant events at the ranch, and I met so many great people who cared so much about keeping the LBJ Ranch as President and Mrs. Johnson wanted. I see a few here today, and they are still supporting the park. I see Tony Reyes, Sam Childers, Jeff Hemphill, and of course I see my favorite, Joel Scott. Happy birthday. Yesterday. Back then, Russ Whitlock was the superintendent. He loved the ranch almost as much as the Johnsons did. He wanted as many people to visit as possible, so we held barbecues, bike rides, farm and ranch days, and movies under the stars. We raised lots of money to help fund special projects for the park, and we had lots of fun doing it. The Fringe Group continues raising money today, and I've heard rumors that the LBJ 100 will be held again. I know Lucy and Ian will be happy to hear that. Before I go, I'd like to thank the entire Johnson family for all they do to keep the LBJ legacy, the city of Johnson City, and the whole area relevant. Lucy, Ian, Linda, Governor Rob, and all the grandchildren give their time and money to keep President and Mrs. Johnson's memories alive. I thank them for allowing me to speak today so that I can keep my grandparents, Melvin and Anita Winter's memories alive. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, you are a tough act to follow. And for someone who was reluctant to speak, and I think I can say that out loud, you highlighted, Shelton, I think, some of the things that make this place so very special. The personal relationships and the connection that people in this community have, the individual stories that people share, anecdotal and humble and powerful, are some of the things that continue to make this particular site, this unit of the Park Service, and LBJ's legacy and Lady Bird's legacy kept alive today. So because we are in a smaller venue and not out at the ranch, we are incredibly off our schedule for the morning. So what I'm going to ask all of us to do is, since we have this time together kind of carved out to commemorate the President's birthday, I would like to invite you to linger a while longer in the Visitor Center, to take this time to share some of your personal stories with each other, and to help keep the memory of President Johnson alive very much on this day when we commemorate his 116th birthday. Thank you so much for being here, and on behalf of the team at the National Park Service, we appreciate you. Can I be super cheeky? Can we sing him happy birthday? Would anyone object? I'm a terrible singer, like for real terrible, but Shelton, will you come up and join me? I'm going to pay for that, by the way, I know. Colonel Freds? I don't know if this has ever been done, so anyway. All right. Okay. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, President Johnson. Happy birthday to you. All right.
Just put a mic on you. Everybody else shut down.